Hello and welcome to the War Report. Happy 2019. We are here with a new year. We bailed out on you last week because, we were on vacation. We don't do the show on vacation. But now that it's the new year, holidays are out of the way, I got my some of my personal life stuff sorted out. We should have a regular show on a regular schedule. But for this, we're not going to do any news of the week. We'll touch on it a little as it relates, but we're going to do a review of the year 2018 geopolitically, all the way from January to December, all the way from the serious strikes to Mattis resigning, just all over the place. Of course, the summer is actually where it gets really packed, but without further ado, we'll jump right into that. So we have January. Now, the first event I really remember in January is Trump threatening Kim Jong-un in North Korea reached its height. And within the first week of the year, Kim Jong-un expressed willingness to meet with Trump and the South Korean leadership, which you can recall all throughout 2017, especially fall 2017. Trump's going to start a nuclear war. North Korea, we're going to war with them. I mean, you saw this, you saw the black pillar saying this. You, of course, saw the leftists saying this, but you saw everyone saying this. And I was thinking, look, we're not going to go to war with them. At most, it'll be like a limited exchange. We'll do like a Syria-style strike on them, but we're not going to war with them. Yeah, I wouldn't have actually predicted negotiations. I feel kind of dumb for missing that one, but I never expected the worst out of this. And lo and behold, we'll get into it later, but you know how that turned out. All because of the "my red button is bigger than yours" tweet.
Yeah, and the Dems basically wanted him to fail at it. And I mean, it was just more scaremongering. Even when Trump got elected, people were just, for no reason at all, saying there's going to be a catastrophic war. He's going to unleash a nuclear Armageddon. And it was ridiculous because all throughout the campaign, it was obvious who was the warmonger and who wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, Trump's controlled by Russia, which means he's going to go to war with Russia. That was the narrative they were honestly trying to spin. Putin is going to order his puppets to bomb him.
The plan is nearly complete.
Oh, of course. Q predicted this.
Plot twist.
Oh, absolutely. But yeah, the North Korean thing, that hit me completely out of nowhere when that first happened this time last year. Because, yeah, it was around this time last year when Kim Jong-un was like, okay, we're sorry, we're done playing this game. Let's actually sit down and talk about it. But just to shift tones a little, we were discussing this a little bit before the show, but you'll notice in January 2018, you go back through the archives, you look for them, you see headlines such as, and I quote, 6 gas attacks in the last 30 days in Syria. And this should have been really obvious. We should have known that there was going to be a false flag sometime, probably in April, with all these things coming up, and not to mention the Trump administration, Rex Tillerson, saying, we believe Assad is developing more chemical weapons after he destroyed his arsenal last year. We believe Assad is doing X, Y, and Z. Assad cannot stay in Syria. You recall Rex Tillerson put the Assad curse on himself. And really early.
I also recall the Russians preempting them with... and a lot of people do watch RT.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And preempting them. So, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, but actually that was in December 2017. Tillerson said, "Look, we're not going to depose Assad, but we think we're going to have to force him out of power by the time ISIS is defeated," which is what they all fucking say. But yeah, I actually did make a couple videos about this before the show even started, because this show didn't start until March of last year. And I covered this in standalone videos. I thought, this is odd. It seems like they're really ramping up the propaganda against Syria. But then I was completely blindsided when they tried to hit us with the chemical attack in April. And in retrospect, I feel really dumb. I mean, look, if I didn't know about the story, it would be a different case. But considering the fact I even talked about the story months before we actually got the false flag, I feel like I really missed something there. I'm wondering what was going on in my head.
The fact is, fewer and fewer people are believing these attacks are either real or that they're not staged by the white helmets. I mean, people, I think even normies joke about this.
Yeah, and there's even that desensitization, like, oh, who cares if Assad did it? Why does it concern us? Like, there's even people who buy that he did it but just don't care, which I would argue is an even more powerful force in trying to keep us out of war there. But
He can barrel bomb all he wants. I don't care, nerd.
yeah, it's like, oh, something bad happened in the Middle East, and it's like that, like it's never happened there before. Wow, wow. But
yeah, who could believe a quarter of a century would desensitize people?
yeah. It's like, all that shit we heard about Iraq and Afghanistan. Oh, bad things are happening in Syria. Oh, who cares? I mean, honestly, I'd hate to say it, but I am pretty desensitized, just doing the show alone. But
Yeah.
just to shift topics here, you also recall January 2018, more so in December 2017, but leading into the new year last year, you had the Iran protests that just erupted out of nowhere. All of a sudden, after the U.S. and Israel sign a pact to counter Iranian aggression, or whatever they called it, but yeah, all of a sudden you just had these spontaneous protests in Iran. They pop up out of nowhere. You have pretty much everyone from everywhere saying, "Oh, look how wonderful and beautiful it is that the Iranian people are standing up to the regime, and this isn't staged at all."
I know. The CIA helps, doesn't it? They're going to make Iran a neoliberal state. It's obvious. It just requires 15-year-old girls dancing in the street. Yeah, I mean it's ridiculous. That was another tactic that nobody fell for.
Yeah, it's
honestly, I think even the West itself is already getting tired of the liberal ethos. You can see that there's this unconscious desire, both on the left and right, for different reasons, to work toward a kind of vertical power, a kind of hierarchy, and this kind of decentralized or fake decentralized, coerced, coercing power is on the way out. I mean, some of the memes that went up around the time of the Iranian protests, which definitely signaled like, Iran, don't change, don't fall for this. I think was the first. I don't think we've ever seen anything like that.
Yeah, I honestly saw people making Thought Patrol memes about it, which I had to admit,
They did.
I partake in a little myself. It was funny though, but I do have to say probably the biggest thing out of this is John Bolton did not accomplish his 2018 New Year's resolution, which was a new regime in Iran by 2019. He didn't do it. It couldn't be done. He hasn't even done it on the Julian calendar.
Oh, that was good. Not even the Julian calendar. You take the L.
Oh, absolutely. And we'll get into the Walrus Warlord later. I don't think his process. I think he's going to be looking for a job real soon. But again, we'll discuss that later. But this was also around the time where spontaneous protests also just so happened to erupt in Russia, with Putin going as far as to accuse the U.S. of election meddling.
Yeah. Except those protests weren't quite as let's say as large or as violent as something that's I mean, they weren't even violent compared to what's happening in France right now.
Yeah, and I can concede on those at least. Is Putin, of course, he's very popular in Russia, but he has this very hardened base of detractors, like that very small but very like fervent group. So I can believe it's more genuine in that case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was over the retirement pension issue, so it is believable. I mean, I think they were genuine.
Yeah, but I don't think it's anywhere to the scale that they want us to believe that people are standing up to the evil Commissar Czar, as the Western propaganda would have you believe.
Yeah, there was the Bloomberg News had a great title that just came out like an hour or two ago. Macron is making Putin look soft. Like, this is an unironic story about, like, I'm sorry, Putin, but neoliberalism just owned you.
Yeah, I think they finally got the victory they were looking for over Vladimir Putin all this time. And all it took was a simple protest. I mean, again, they kept on hammering on about human rights. It turns out when you throw them out the window, you can compete with Putin. It's amazing, as a matter of fact. But January, it was a decent month, but it wasn't anything like April or the summer. But let's get into February right away. So February was pretty much marked by the reconciliation of the two Koreas, truly beginning. You had Moon and Kim Jong-un having their first of frequent meetings throughout the year. And the most significant thing that most people will probably remember is the two Koreas during the opening ceremony at the Olympics in actually South Korea that year. They were together. They had the teams out together, which pretty much showed that, yes, their leadership is cooperating on it, but not only that, but their people are also standing side by side. You know, it's not anything significant, but very symbolic. I think pretty much everyone could admit that.
Yeah, I mean, the media has largely ignored it now, but that's sort of the case of, the kind of postmodern world that we live in. Korea is nearly forgotten now, but whether it's deep state or other forces in conjunction, Korea's importance was catapulted front and center for the beginning of 2018, and even well into early summer, late spring.
Oh yeah, I mean you'll recall Trump became our generation's Neville Chamberlain today. All those things they just spun. It's funny because basically after the summit, they pretty much gave up on all that and conceded their defeat. 2018, we'll see a theme. I'm not saying the deep state, the globalists, the neoliberals, call them whatever you'd like. They're pretty much all applicable. I'm not saying they lost this year, actually far from, but I'm saying they conceded a lot of ground and made themselves look very weak, particularly in France, which we'll get towards at the end of the episode. But yeah, that's a consistent theme I've noticed. The fact that they don't even seem to have the will to fight to keep their world order, to the point where they, whether subconsciously or consciously, know that this is terrible and nobody likes this, and we should let it dismantle itself. Now, whether they actually think those thoughts or not, I think it's something subconscious, even in the minds of these evil sons of bitches who run this country or run this world, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, well, there was an article just recently, a little interview with Slavoj Žižek, and he still basically supports Trump, especially when Trump's failings are brought up. He'll mention, well, the likelihood of going to war in Korea or Syria would have been exponentially greater had she been elected than Trump. But to add, just to go a little further with the article, one of the things he mentioned was that Trump has pushed a wedge into the neoliberal order, and I think ever since he first began running for election, he's done this. He has said a number of things that are absolutely heretical against a neoliberal order, a neoliberal empire, and nationalism is just one of them. But then into specific things we're pulling out of Syria, or Israel is fine. They get a lot of money. I don't care if Iran stays in Syria. I mean, that was shocking. If you're one of these rats in the neoliberal order, that was absolutely shocking. And nothing, even that wouldn't have prepared you. Even 2017 or 2018 would have prepared you for that.
Well, I said this on the show over this past year, and I still hold to it. I think Trump, despite the fact, he's offered significant pushback. Of course, he's not anything like Rand Paul or Pat Buchanan would have been. Of course, I would have preferred either of those two. Even like Ron Paul, the elder Paul. But all that aside, Trump has forced them to get sloppy with their plans. He's forced them to accelerate to a point where, for example, they'll try these false flags. They'll try these things. For example, the Kerch Strait, which we'll get into it. They do these really sloppy things that nobody believes. And if they do believe, they don't really care about. And they've made themselves look like fools because they fear this guy who was honestly a celebrity billionaire.
It's the irony of it. It's so deliciously funny. Trump, even with not in terms of long range, what happens, I'm not saying the picture for us is great, or it's not going to be great, and it's not going to be easy. However, his primary contribution has been to be an open heretic at the top level of this system.
Yeah, I think we pretty much, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's not even saying anything about like what the Soviet Union did or didn't do, but I think just that ushering in of that order, the way the neoliberal world order was going to collapse, it wasn't going to be pretty. But I think what Trump has done, I think he's let a lot of pressure out of the valve to the point where it does collapse. It's not going to be as nasty as it would have been.
Yeah. I mean, that's a valid point.
Now, just more February news is this was the first time we really saw the open clashes between Iran and Israel, pretty much since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, with Israel suffering losses at the hands of the Syrian air defenses after the Israelis were prompted to strike Syria after an Iranian drone was shot down over the Golan Heights. You'll remember that. That was early February, where they basically had that firefight, and even like the Israel couldn't stand up to the S-200s, which was really showing how incompetent they are, which that'll be a recurring theme as we go over this year in Israel's actions. That the fact that they have all these things, they have all this backing, and oh boy, I just saw what happened in the chat. That's kind of funny. Apparently, Trump replied to Jim Acosta with "Dear Diary," digging up a bit of an old meme. But again, that just goes to that what we were just talking about with Trump. But what I was saying is that just showed how incompetent the Israelis were when they had pretty much every advantage, but they still botched this attack on Syria and the Iranian targets in Syria in February.
Mm-hmm. And they're getting less mileage out of it. I mean, I wonder if they're even going to plan another attack this year. I think they've run out.
I think they lost the steam, especially with Netanyahu, with his internal troubles with his corruption investigations and the snap election they just called.
Oh, sorry, I meant like another fake gas attack. I think that's
I know.
Done.
I don't think Israel has. Sorry, my dog is forcing me to. Sorry, my dogs got into a bit of something with each other. They were fighting over a ball, but I have 2 dogs for those of you who care. But yeah, as I was saying, I don't think like Israel, especially the current administration in power, is going to be able to even pull off some kind of shenanigans this year, mainly because I think Israel as a country has pretty much lost the will for it. I think especially the current administration, Netanyahu facing an election and corruption charges, isn't really going to try to pull anything too risky.
Yeah.
And
I don't think so either. I mean, things have so ramped up, even in the last month or two, that I think a lot of their options have been narrowed.
Yeah, I mean, Israel burned a lot of political capital. So even if something does happen in Syria, trying to pull us back in, I don't think it's going to be through them. And I'll actually get into my thoughts on the Syria withdrawal and its stifling later in the show. But speaking of Syria and false flags and chemical attacks, and you have to recall, February 2018 was when Mattis, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, even admitted there's still no conclusive evidence that the 2017 Duma gas attacks were done by Assad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not working anymore. I don't know what they plan for this spring. Every successive year, because Assad has regained so much more ground, every year it looks less and less reasonable to assume that he's responsible for these gas attacks.
Yeah,
so,
I mean,
yeah.
2013 is when it really came to a head, like when Assad actually was looking like he was going to lose the war and suffer the fate of Gaddafi. It's interesting because you got to realize a lot of people called Obama weak for not following up to his red line, but a lot of people forget Obama went to Congress asking for a declaration of war, which means the only thing that stopped from overthrowing Assad was the fact that Congress said no to Obama. Because, again, a lot of people criticize Trump for the Syria strikes, myself and yourself included, but Obama actually tried to go in for a full regime change, but he just couldn't get the approval for it.
I know. People forget that. And I do wonder often why Congress, and to that we would assume mostly Republicans, were not in favor of going. I mean, was it really about not wanting valor stolen, after the fiasco of the Bush regime? That seems to be maybe the only answer I can think of, other than knowing that they weren't prepared.
Yeah, I would say that, and not to mention that's pretty much when you also had like the rise. You pretty much had like the precursor to the fact that the Republicans were turning into sort of the Trump party, especially with Rand Paul out there. It was his actually first term in the Senate. He was like a first year senator, and he was out there pretty much the whole Syria debacle in 2013 is what really put him on the map. Him speaking out against that, and I think the Republicans. I think it was pretty much partisan things that kept us out of war. And there were a few Democrats that also pushed back against it. But point being is, fortunately enough, Obama did not get the congressional approval for an outright regime change in Syria. But
yeah, and you could look at it as 2013, right after the so-called Arab Spring. That 2013, that attempt in itself was the first kind of open, brazen attempt that the primary purpose of America and the West was, global homo regime change. That it was going to be a liberal, like a decidedly liberal order, not just democracy, but a liberal democratic order.
Yeah, overthrowing dictators for women's rights or whatever.
In a direction more specific and further than what Bush had established.
Yeah, because Bush was actually, say what you will about like the Bush neocons, but at least they trotted out the excuse like, oh, if we don't do this, the terrorists will win. At least they tried to convince you that it was in your interests rather than just some feel-good ideological thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're still, I mean, not that they're effective really in terms of international policy, but that's still the narrative right now.
Yeah, it is, but like you said, it's pretty much diminished in the point where, as we were talking about with the Iran process, they try to do it like we have to help these oppressed minorities, or we have to help the Kurds defend themselves because they're an oppressed minority. They do the pretty liberal talking points now, but I do want to get on. We have actually the show's almost halfway over at this point, but I wanted to get on just with the rest of the year with March, because March was a pretty eventful month that I didn't realize just by looking back on it. So you began March with the populist revolt, as I like to call it. It began to sweep Europe, especially with the victories of Lega Nord and the Five Star Movement in the Italian elections at the beginning of March. I believe it was March 4th. And they completely swept it, even though it was a while before the Italian government was actually formed. Point being, it looked like they were either going to be the primary opposition or the ruling party.
Yeah, that was a surprise. Especially because the year before Le Pen didn't get elected, but I think the last 2 years, especially, you can see that there, with ups and downs, is a gradual move away from what we've been used to for the last 6 years in terms of the liberal order.
Oh, absolutely. It's almost like a crash landing where, it's going to be better in the long run. Like, it's going to diffuse a lot of tensions, but it's going to be a very bumpy ride getting there. But also in terms of elections in March, we had Vladimir Putin soundly winning re-election in Russia. I bet nobody saw that one coming. Total upset in that election. And then that's not even the significant story I want to cover. Trump then commits the high crime of congratulating Putin and saying he's willing to work with him on the issues our two countries face together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that was a no-no because, of course, Trump is a puppet. I mean, it's obvious. I think a lot of these very high-powered brokers of the West, I think they understand what the next 10, 20 years are going to be like in the West, and that a lot of the problems of the West are internal. They're not dependent on Russia. However, they understand that this ultimately means Russia will be in a better power position in the next 10, 20 years because of it.
Oh, and yeah, and it's also the ultimate scapegoat.
Right, but I also think that's why they push hard against it. It's not just that Russia for the last 10 years has represented this kind of ideological alternative. Not that Russia is a proposition nation. It's not by any stretch of the imagination. However, I think the fundamentals of neoliberalism are becoming so much weaker that they already saw that this was the case even before even before Maidan, or very early on when the December of 2013.
Or
So I
even
think,
like the Rose Revolution in 2008 in Georgia.
yeah, that's true. That's true. So I think they understand where things are going to go, the kind of problems that are seeded into our civilization that that come with being in an empire, and I think they understand that, and they do not want to relinquish the power position that they have, t any amount of it to Russia. So
Oh, absolutely. And to continue on with the events of March, this is really when the U.S.-Chinese trade war. I mean, there were brewings of it, but this is pretty much when it began, and it's ongoing as we speak. And honestly, for me personally, this is when I was finally fed up with China because, of course, I'm still a young man. I'm an amateur, but at this by all means. But I still consider myself pretty well educated in this. I thought for the longest time, if we just talk it out with China, if we just make some new deals, we can be fine and we won't have to confront them. We won't have to be tough on them. We can smooth things over. But by the beginning of the trade war, I came to a conclusion that China as a country, as a leadership, as a culture, cannot be reasoned with. Nor is it even in our interests at this point to even try to reason with them. And the only thing they will understand is isolation and cutting off ties from them and finding alternatives to them, if not our own domestic manufacturing, finding other countries in Asia and cooperating with other Asian countries to keep the Chinese down just because I don't know. I just came to a very real realization on China that we cannot work with them, and they are pretty much, even though I'm not a liberal by any means, opposed to everything we stand for.
yeah, and that's exactly what Trump eventually did with the tariffs, and they blinked first.
Oh, absolutely, and yeah, they're still blinking. The one thing about Trump is at the end of the day, he's the businessman. He wants to strike the better deal. I know it's not entirely realistic, and I would argue for a more gradual process. I want to slowly pull our assets out of China. I want to slowly pull our money and our business out of China and move it elsewhere. And I kind of want to leave the country just to its own devices and have nothing to do with it. I'm not saying should have to confront them in Africa like some people do. I want to confront the foreign influence they have in this country and countries like Canada, Australia, and our actual allies. But I don't want to go around confronting them halfway across the world, especially when the resource we'd be competing for them with are right in our backyard.
Yeah, I mean, Brzezinski, before he passed away, one of the things that he stipulated was that we do not follow China into Africa, that it was not important. And that's exactly what's happening. It just boggles me. I mean, he's been an advisor for the CIA and every administration for 50 years.
You know, I'd say for how much of a train wreck that man's ideology was, he had those few nuggets.
He did, yeah.
Yeah. And you know, it's a shame that was overshadowed by pretty much everything else. But March continues to be an interesting month. With you'll recall, this is when Mohammed bin Salman became the darling of the media with his visits to London, Washington, his face plastered on the billboards, the literal red carpets being rolled out for him, his meetings with Theresa May and U.S. officials. He didn't actually meet with Trump in person when he was in Washington, which is actually a bit surprising. I think he actually ended up meeting with Kushner. I could be wrong, but the point being is the mainstream media, everyone from CNN to MSNBC to Fox, talked about how much of a great reformer he was, how great he's going to be for U.S.-Saudi relations, how he's going to help us with X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and that seemed. I mean, the coverage was so glowing, and I have never recalled the media ever focusing that deeply and positively on anybody in Saudi Arabia. That was unusual.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia was always the open secret, but then they went a step further and said, "Oh, look at how great this guy is."
Mm-hmm. And then October came around.
Oh boy, just wait until we get to that. But
Yeah.
also in March 2018, the UK accused Russia of attempting to assassinate former SBS agent Sergei Skripal with a nerve agent in Salisbury. Now, this led to most Western nations expelling Russian diplomats. The UK begins to assume the hawkishness role that the US somewhat abandoned on Russia. Now, rumor has it Trump was outraged when he learned that the expelled Russian diplomats were done so on a case that didn't even have a conclusive any evidence that it actually happened. So it's funny because I think 2017 Trump was more the naive year. He's like, oh, I trust these guys. They're my advisors. Mike Pence wouldn't do me wrong, since Mike Pence picked most of his cabinet and his advisors. And then by 2018 rolls around, I think especially in this case, like maybe they're playing me. Maybe they aren't on my side. And I think that's also another theme in 2018 where Trump really starts to wake up himself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think 2017 formed Trump, or it at least pushed him back to his approach the kind of person that we saw in 2016. Which is really encouraging, honestly, because 2017 was not a good year.
Oh, absolutely.
And 2018 was a year of a hell of a lot of surprises coming out of Trump.
Yeah, 2018 was, as we've used this phrase for months now, like the year of the tug of war. Like he realizes that, yeah, I got played by Mike Pence in the establishment, and I have to pull like hell if I want control of my administration, not only on foreign policy, but immigration, pretty much every other issue that's not tax cuts.
Yeah.
And then for March, in late March 2018, it looked like Trump was building a war cabinet, unfortunately. Now, fortunately, that didn't pan out. With the departure of Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, he was replaced with, as you all know, CIA Director Mike Pompeo, a move that was actually predicted by many in November 2017. He also announced that National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster was leaving to be replaced by John Bolton. Now, in retrospect, we can see this was probably a good cop, bad cop type thing for North Korea. Also probably throwing some bones to the neoconservatives. And it looked like more of an appeasement move. And, oh, here's my scary junkyard dogs. You can talk to me or you can talk to them.
Right. I mean, nobody was happy with the picks. But then again, we've had 52, far more than that, probably 60, 70 years of institutions that are geared to weed out anybody that you and I would like to be on Trump's team.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not happy with John Bolton, but the fact that you can send him to actually have a conversation with Putin, that's something that will only happen under somebody like Trump.
Yeah.
And now, John Bolton, actually, he didn't take office. He didn't assume his position as National Security Advisor until April 9th, convenient date there. But on April 5th, Trump announced that he was considering pulling out of Syria. Now, days later, on April 8th, Assad supposedly used chemical weapons. Now, April 9th through 13th was marked by several Israeli strikes on Syrian targets and Iranian targets in Syria, as well as inconsistent messages from Trump, which ended up with a limited strike on April 13th, similar to the limited strike he did in 2017. On the bright side, this woke a lot of people up. A lot of people, I thought, oh, you're just a total shill. You just buy into the establishment lines. There was a lot of skepticism that this attack even happened. A lot of people who were very Zionistic questioned Israel's statements and asked, oh, if you're so afraid of Syria, why don't you just fight your own war? I saw that coming from people like the alt-right, like your Jack Priloseks, your Cernoviches, people you thought like, oh, you're just marginally anti-establishment, but you'll go along with anything that they say to do. And like I said, this was John Bolton's first week on the job, and it is very predictable that someone like him would come to a job and this would happen.
Right. Some of these old guys from the Bush administration, I think, but by now I think they're realizing just how spent they are. I mean, even if Hillary got elected, these guys would already be, a used item.
Yeah.
But in a sense, Trump taking them over somebody that Hillary or Mitt Romney might have had is preferable, because in a way, they know they're done. They know that they're going to have possibly less respect, not more. And so, in hindsight, now that I look back, Trump might have been wise to choose these guys.
Oh, it's hilarious because he picked these neocons, and instead of them controlling him, he controlled them. He blows off their advice when he doesn't like it, and I think he probably establishes, probably especially behind closed doors, who's in charge. Now, another thing I want to say about the Syria strike week is that is when Tucker Carlson, who before then I thought, oh yeah, he's good by mainstream media standards, but he's nothing spectacular. But you'll remember he spent an entire week railing against the possibility of war with Syria, and that's when I really think he also became one of the people on our quote unquote side.
Yeah.
Is
Sorry?
Yeah. So I think that was also very indicative of the shift because I mean, you gotta keep in mind a lot of like the mainstream conservatives, a lot of the normal conservatives would listen to somebody on Fox News for prime time like Tucker Carlson, and then all of a sudden you have him saying, "Oh, the president shouldn't go to war in Syria. He shouldn't break this campaign promise." That wakes a lot of people up who would otherwise say, "Oh, we need to get rid of the evil dictator X, Y, and Z."
Right. Yeah. I think Tucker Carlson in 2018 is as shocking as Donald Trump in 2016 for the same reasons.
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
There's been, there have been a lot of points that, in the dissident right or some elements of the alt-right, and this is stretching, at least 10 years back, who have discussed, for instance, healthcare or basically the opposite of most neocon positions, domestically or internationally. And Tucker Carlson is literally voicing them on Fox.
It's prime time. He's their prime time slot.
I know, and his audience is enormous. That was really shocking. I remember when I first noticed that Tucker had started saying some definitive things that, and of course Twitter was right on him saying these are alt-right talking points and so on. But I'm astonished. I'm actually astonished.
Yeah, and just to continue on April, well, we might actually go a bit longer today. It's not like I care, but April also saw a lot more progress between the Korean issue, where the seeds were actually sown for the June summit that people thought, oh yeah, Trump is eventually going to sit down with Kim Jong-un. I don't know when, I don't know where, but it's likely going to happen this year.
Mm-hmm.
And just to finish off April, after the Syria strikes, it was a very quiet month. And it was pretty much marked by, oh, good thing we didn't go to war with Syria. And even though a lot of people thought we were, a lot of people who either wanted it or didn't want it thought like, oh, yay, we're going to war with Syria, or oh, no, we're going to war with Syria. But it was also marked by a mysterious absence of Mohammed bin Salman after a failed coup attempt, is what they call it in Saudi Arabia, where they flew one of those little remote-controlled drones near the palace, and the Saudi bodyguards tried to shoot it. It was like 10 feet in front of them. They missed every time. Do you remember that?
I do. And then we heard all the stories about all these. Didn't he have like his own mother tied up, or not necessarily his mother, but the mother of one of his half brothers? I mean, that was just crazy.
Yeah, he like kidnapped his one cousin. I mean, like this is actually how he really got started. Like in 2017, you'll remember he had them all held hostage at that one hotel. But then he kept on doing that, and people just stopped talking about that for whatever reason. But yeah, he was like he was holding somebody like under house arrest in the palace when that event happened.
Yeah. I mean, not that I care about Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia also figured quite prominently in 2018. For one, we know much more about them than we did before. As you say, they're not an open secret anymore. And I think that also speaks to like where we are right now as a civilization, because it was always important to kind of tap things down on what was going on there, or to not report on it, and but that's not the case anymore. And
Yeah,
that's
they were always viewed by the media as the necessary evil until Mohammed bin Salman early on. Then they became good, and then of course the Khashoggi thing happened, and now they're the worst thing in the world. But to continue on the year, May 2018. Now in early May, the spotlight was on Iran for the first 2 weeks of the year. Netanyahu claimed that Israeli intelligence obtained undeniable proof that Iran is developing nuclear weapons, and did a primetime presentation in English with that PowerPoint with all those racks of CDs. And this was the thing that led Trump to decide to leave the Iran deal. But you'll remember that, just undeniable proof. Oh no, look at this. We found all these CDs because the Iranians are so primitive that they're still using floppy disks.
Yeah. I mean, nobody. I mean, the memes that went up were hilarious around that time.
Oh, absolutely.
You would think, like, their intelligence was capable of having better displays, and orchestrating these things a little bit better. What wasn't convincing at all.
Yeah, I mean, you figure intelligence agencies have what they do is forge evidence. You figured they would have a bit of a better hand on it, especially when you listen to a lot of the very pro-Zionist people tell you about how great Israeli intelligence is. You figure they would have this under wraps. You figure they would show oh yeah, we found these 3 or 4 USBs with all this information on it, not these floppy disks.
Yeah. I mean, it was literally like they asked somebody in Hollywood, uh, you know, how to go about this. It was literally based on it wasn't based on any research, any knowledge. Presumably, there's Israeli spies all over Iran. I'm very sure there is, and going with CDs and floppy disks. That was quite funny.
Yeah,
Didn't help the case.
Also, smaller thing that happened in May of 2018 that a lot of people overlooked is Hezbollah made considerable gains in the Lebanese election. Because aside from being a militant group, they're also a political party with armed factions. It's a very but many speculated, including myself, that Israel would actually attempt to push into southern Lebanon again, like they did in 2006. That I was expecting them to also lose like they did in 2000. Israeli incompetence would be a reoccurring theme on this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think they understand. Netanyahu has his problems. He has his election. He probably will not be reelected. Not that I'm an expert. Somebody would probably correct me on that. But if his wife is charged, to me it seems less likely. But yeah, they're looking right now with the attacks pretty desperate. They're not getting the support that they had hoped for, and in the same way that Trump has forced the neocons to accelerate by just giving enough pressure in the opposite direction. This acceleration is, lifting the mask, and that's something they can't afford, because our civilization happens to work on a kind of presupposition of openness and decentralization, when in fact it isn't, right? So on those premises, the coordination behind it has to be very elaborate and has to be very well crafted, and we're not seeing that. So we're seeing a lot of fissures and a lot of cracks developing.
Yeah, and just while we're on this aside, whether they say it in a podcast, say Trump is no president, I can contest that. I mean, they'll point to the embassy move, they'll point to but you'll notice a lot of the moves he's paid are symbolic and in lip service. But a lot of his moves actually, even just oh yeah, we're going to kind of sort of leave Syria, drained the political capital of now that's Netanyahu's party, amongst just because you have Netanyahu, look, the U.S. is going to stand by of ours. But then you have Trump making all these inconsistent moves. One day he's all for Israel, the next day we're pulling out of Syria. Takes the confidence of Netanyahu and his government and his party in the eyes of your average Israeli.
Yeah.
Still there? Okay. But
Hello?
I want to continue on just on the Israeli. Hello?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, bit of an internet hiccup. Continue on the Israeli-Iran topic in May of 2018. Israel celebrated the U.S. lead by bombing Iranian assets in Syria as well as Syrian targets. Now, the SAA, the Syrian Arab Army, not the Iranians, returned fire, leading to a heights and bringing tensions between Syria and Israel to the highest they've been since the 1970s. Israel came out as the loser of this little skirmish, again, having their assets down by 100.
Hello?
Hello?
Sorry, you were
wait, hey, you keep the audience entertained. I'll be right back.
okay. So what do you guys think in the chat? What's the biggest story of the year for you guys?
How are we now?
Oh, okay. Yeah, you're good.
That's actually the longest we've gone without a hiccup. I'm actually a bit impressed.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, because it's like quarter till now, and we still got a lot to go through. But yeah, I'm pretty impressed with my internet today. Then, but yeah, Israel celebrated this by bombing. Celebrated the U.S. leaving the Iran deal by bombing Iranians in Syria as well as Syrian targets. Now, the SAA, not the Iranians, which a lot of media said it was, returned fire, leading to a skirmish over the Golan Heights and bringing tensions to the highest they've been between Syria and Israel, to the highest they've been since the 1973 war. Israel came out as the loser because they made themselves look so damn incompetent yet again.
Yeah, I can't remember. It was and this was after one of their helicopters and one of their fighters were shot down a few months after.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was like, obviously they think Trump does something in their favor, and that gives them the green flag to do something that embarrasses America. It's almost like, look, they're completely unaware. Like, they espouse this idea that they're an ally and the greatest ally of America ever. And at the same time, they take advantage of America's good graces.
Oh, absolutely. And you have F-16s and F-22s getting downed by Russian spare S-200s that they gave to Syria because they figured, we got all money in the round, we're not using them, have them, Assad. You're having these supposedly great high-tech fighter planes from the U.S. being downed by almost 3 generation outdated anti-aircraft systems from the Russians. Now that can tell us a few things here. That says, A, our technology isn't as good as we say they are, which it may be true to an extent, especially with the way the F-35 is, but I think U.S. technology, up until recently, was actually pretty good. Like, it would actually do its job. Or B, which I think is the lot more likely one, Israeli military personnel are so incompetent that they cannot maneuver an F-16 or an F-35 or any of these whole slew of advanced weapons they get from the United States and the Western world. They can't get that out of around outdated Russian technology.
Yeah. I mean, they're using other means. Some people have argued that they might have already struck a deal with the Russians to, not help the Syrians. I personally think they're probably using jammers, and they're hiding. I mean, it's obvious now they are hiding under civilian aircraft, even military aircraft, which we can get into later.
Yeah.
In order to avoid
even with all those advantages, they still manage to botch whatever they do.
Yeah.
But just further going on about Israel's incompetence. Now, on May 15th, you'll all recall, the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem was opened after Trump announced in December 2017 that we were moving the embassy after Clinton signed the law in like 1995. Now, this led to clashes between the Israeli forces and the Palestinians near the Gaza border. Now, this was a massive PR defeat for Israel, another show of incompetence. Now, I ask you in the audience, I ask anyone listening to this, to put aside who you think was in the right morally on that case, whether you think it was a slaughter of Palestinians or a justified control of terrorists, such repelling Hamas attacks, put all of that aside. This shows, no matter what you think, that Israel is incapable of even the most basic crowd control measures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think people are under the assumption that Israel is still what it was in the 60s and 70s. Israel, I think, is the first to know that they can't survive without America.
Oh yeah, I mean, fighting Sunni Arabs like throughout the 60s and 70s, they had no problem. But the minute they actually had to fight, more the Shia axis from, pardon the expression, from Iran to Syria to Hezbollah, they've shown themselves completely incompetent. Now, we all know that Sunni Arabs are historically terrible fighters. And I question, did Israeli fighters get worse, or did they finally meet their match and they were just fighting just a completely incompetent enemy before that?
I think they have met their match, and the reason I say that is because the kind of enemies that Israel has to face, if we're just squaring up technology, Israel has far superior weaponry than they did in the 60s and 70s. However, when they attempted to go into Lebanon in 2006, 15 Merkava tanks did not make it in past 500 yards into. They were all taken out. 15 of them were taken out. Think about that. These Merkava tanks, by the way, are tweaked, if you will, Abrams tanks with active shield support. The metal bends to absorb some of the impact when a missile enters it, but it didn't do any good. And it was primarily the mothers of these men who perished in the tanks that organized the rallies for Israel to leave Lebanon.
Yeah.
So,
and just on that, Israel is stuck in the third generation of warfare. They still think massive armies where pretty much every young able-bodied man who can serve will serve. They take that mentality, something you would have had throughout World War I, World War II, even like into Vietnam or so, and are fighting against a fourth generation warfare. So you have all these people that, whether just their willingness, I don't know. The point being, they're drafted to fight. They're fighting against ideological radicals, which is what Hezbollah are. They're very ideologically, they're Lebanese nationalists and they're devout Shia Muslims. Say about that what you will, but you're putting a conscript army with outdated tactics up against the new generation of warfare, which are people who are committed to their ideology, people are committed to what they believe in. They may have inferior weapons, but they're still going to win because they've adopted the new tactics, and they're pretty much warfare in the 21st century fighting warfare in the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why they're showing their hand more. I think they're running out of options. So,
I mean, even the U.S. has the sense, like, Vietnam, we had the draft. We sent in a bunch of, we lost 60,000 personnel by the end of Vietnam, but we rectified. And the U.S., we've stumbled our way into fourth generation warfare. We've mainly gotten other groups to do it, but more or less we managed to do it. Israel has not, but just on that point being, Israel is completely incompetent. And, whether you support them, think they're morally in the right or whatever, you have to admit that the people in charge of their military, of their political structure, have no idea what they're doing. They're chickens with their head cut off. But more actually good news that came out of May 2018 was when the Korea summit was officially going to happen. It was officially announced. Now, despite a mishap during that, now Kim Jong-un invited Trump to meet him in Singapore on June 12th, and Trump agreed. Now, Trump pulled out the same day after Kim Jong-un decided to just test the water, see how far he could go, by insulting Mike Pence. But Kim Jong-un later apologized after Trump pulled out because he realized, okay, that's the line I can't cross. He was pretty much testing the waters. And that happened within 12 hours, and the summit was back on, scheduled for June 12th. Now, another thing that came out of April, apparently, May, my apologies. apparently beginning of May was very tense, then it very quickly boiled down. Because you had Putin hammer out this rickety peace deal between Israel and Iran fighting in Syria, which worked for a few months. Of course, it fell through, but it worked a lot longer than I was expecting it to.
Yeah. Not that I expected great things from it, despite the efforts. Israel isn't going to change its position at all. It will renege. It's not an honest player.
Oh, yeah. And it's draining all its political capital and geopolitical capital to the point where, aside from your John Boltons, which are few and far between, fortunately, they're losing support even amongst the American establishment because, again, like you said, they play the greatest ally card, but then they constantly embarrass us it was actually to a point there was almost on a weekly basis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then we have to have media outlets that either don't cover it or cover it as some kind of a, self-defense, or somebody threw a rock over the fence in the Golan Heights. This is why we're doing it.
Yeah, to the point like where I said they've overplayed their hand so much that the American establishment is pissed off with them. Now, Getting into June, the summer of 2018 was very, very eventful. Now, June started out as a terrible week for the European Union with the formation of the new Eurosceptic government in Italy that also wanted to lift sanctions on Russia. Now, this was really the rising strength of the populist bloc, which really started with Orban in 2015, but this really saw Italy, Poland, Austria, Hungary, there were a couple other ones, Romania later on, really started to forge together and decide, we're going to stay in the European Union, but we're also going to try to steer the direction of the European Union. And you know what? Some of us might leave. And it really saw that formation of a strong opposition to the Merkels and Macrons of the European Union.
Yeah, that was another very positive change that happened. I was, I was already thinking, the year previous that eventually that there would become some kind of a bloc that would form. It would be generally Eastern European. I didn't foresee necessarily Italy being part of it, but that they would push for lifting sanctions against Russia off. Also, generally trying to improve ties, right, with Russia, which is the exact opposite of where the EU is going. But I predicted that would happen because, well, besides some cultural differences, Eastern Europe is on a totally different wavelength than Western Europe, even at the elite level. Like, I don't just mean the citizenry. I mean the elite level is highly skeptical, and they don't see them, because they eventually have to. They have to be elected, and they know they're populists, and they're not going to be elected based on the platforms that are institutionalized within Western Europe. On that, can you just give me 1 second, please? I'll be back in just 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll keep the chat entertained. But, oh boy, 2018 was quite the year, and we still got half the year to go, and we're almost an hour into the show. We're going to run a little long tonight. Sorry about that, guys. If you like the longer shows, let me know. But, yeah, as I was saying, you had this really populist bloc forming, this more friendly with Russia, anti-European Union. And you know what? Poland is actually a bit of an exception in that one, seeing as Poland is still very anti-Russia, which I can't necessarily blame them, but that's also on their government level, because you see a lot of people in their populace. I've talked to a few Poles myself, and they actually do have a positive opinion of the Russians and don't hate them as much as the mainstream media and historians would lead you to believe. So, yeah, I thought that was a bit interesting, but I will move on to the next topic. Hopefully, GSP won't be too lost when he gets back.
No, I'm back.
Oh, yeah. I just pretty much rehashed what you said, but on the next topic, we somewhat touched on this earlier, but we saw Trump beginning to take more of a hold over his own foreign policy around the time of the G7 meeting in Canada, where he was very defiant and he challenged Merkel and Macron over trade. Now, you'll recall this is the same meeting where he threw the starburst at Merkel and said, "Don't say I never gave you anything." And you'll recall he also repeated this move earlier today with Schumer and Pelosi. He had them at the White House.
Yeah, this is how you know Trump is back, when he throws Starburst at somebody.
I think he threw an almond joy at Nancy Pelosi today. I think that was the story.
What did he mean by that?
Oh yeah, but point being, you have good Trump when he's pelting candy at people.
Yeah. Signature move, man.
I mean, that's honestly one of the things I would not have expected. That's probably one of the best things to come out of 2018. But also during the G7 meeting, this was with when Trump, along with the new Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte, suggested that Russia should be allowed to rejoin the organization. And Trump pretty much admitted without saying it that Crimea is Russian, and there's really no point in challenging it now.
Yeah, again, that was a talking point of maybe somebody, not of the caliber of Ron Paul, but someone associated with his camp in politics. The idea that an American
relative,
yeah, the idea that the president of the United States would say something like that. I mean, that just destroyed everything from helping the coup happen in the first place to every single false flag that we're going to have in the future.
It's funny because the way he worded it, he didn't even say Crimea was Russian. He basically said, "Oh yeah, Russia took it. It was Obama's fault, and there's really no point in fighting it." Now he maneuvered himself around that in an ingenious way.
Right, but I think he also did mention that. Well, most people speak Russian there, anyways.
Wait, yeah, he did actually say that. Yeah, most people speak Russian, and that's the point I've been making. But that was also a very good week because we actually covered this. This is the first episode you actually started becoming a regular on the show. We covered the G7, and then we covered the summit in Singapore, which was a resounding success. Probably one of Trump's greatest successes of 2018, if not the greatest, even if it was just about optics, even if it was just a symbolic meeting where no real treaties were signed between the U.S. and North Korea. And neocons everywhere were enraged by this meeting. It also laid the groundwork for solid progress and cooperation between the North and the South, despite the fact that negotiations have fallen through a bit between the U.S. and North Korea. At least the two Koreas are cooperating, and that's in large credit to that meeting.
Yeah, I think the other players are more or less either uninterested or are not upset with Korea working on reuniting. I don't see any significant pushback against the process. I mean, really, the only people who were against it were neocons and Democrats.
Yeah, and honestly, I thought CNN. China would be a lot harder against it, but I think they realized, North Korea's lost cause. Let's go see what we can do in Africa.
Yeah, I would say so. Russia certainly doesn't seem to have any great objections to it. I mean,
imagine if the Koreas start cooperating, building like infrastructure between the two. Imagine how quickly the Russians would go to both of them with a pipeline offer.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And with resources from Kamchatka, Russians would be very eager to develop Vladivostok. So yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you've had Russian smugglers there for decades. Now they just make the business official.
Oof.
Yeah. But perhaps most significantly, June 2018, not most significantly, but pretty big story a lot of people overlooked. We discussed this on the show back in June. The Syrian rebel stronghold, the cradle of the revolution, Daraa, fell to Assad at the end of June without even a statement of condemnation from the United States, which many were expecting that we would launch at least a limited strike over it. But it really set the tone for U.S. policy in Syria going forward, even though we didn't withdraw then. And the withdrawal currently is still up in the air, and there's still a lot of things to be decided, and still is very uncertain at the time. But it really set the tone that the U.S. wasn't really serious about destabilizing Syria anymore, at least to the degree Trump had any control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when I first saw Assad's going into Dra, I saw some of the Russian media saying, "Oh, there may be another false flag, so
Yeah,
watch out for that."
yeah,
I
yeah.
saw some other people saying that, and I admit the Russians have gotten a lot of it right, but they also are quick to jump on that one. Not entirely without reason, but again, they are very cautious. That in some cases too cautious, I'd say. But let's move on to July because those are probably one of the best months of the year, at least geopolitically. Now, July did kick off with a bit of an obscure episode, probably one of the worst episodes I've ever done, at least personally. And it kicked off with the Mexican elections and the victory for the left wing populist, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, which I'm just going to call him AMLO like everyone else does for short, which sparked fear in many, including myself, with his comments encouraging his population to go to the U.S. and send back remittances, his hard stance on trade. But ironically enough, AMLO, even as president elect, even before assuming office in December, was more cooperative with Trump than his predecessor, which was Enrique Pena Nieto, who paid a lot of lip service to Trump, but ultimately didn't cooperate with him on anything. Whereas you had Vicente Fox, who's the president before him, which is the one who was like, "Oh, fuck Trump," and has Twitter following, all the white leftists on Twitter, all the white American leftists who just love him. While you have his own people who absolutely hate him.
Yeah, I know. Funny how that works.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what I've been seeing with a lot of Bolsonaro. Like all the Brazilians online, they're very happy with him, but you have all these Western leftists who are just talking about how terrible he is. But on top of that, yeah, AMLO, despite being like a hard left, he turned out to be a very cooperative partner, and I actually see U.S.-Mexican relations going in a very good direction in the coming years. But another thing in 2018 that pretty much put a lot of my fears to rest was the slew of the anti-Iranian propaganda, which consistently fell on deaf ears. For example, they were going to, bomb some Iranian resistance movement in Paris. There's going to be a terrorist attack here, here, and here. Look at all these terrorist attacks sponsored by Iran, actually Saudi Arabia, but we're telling you it's Iran because of narrative reasons. And how that just fell on deaf ears, how there was no outrage about Iran doing X, Y, or Z, supposedly. And
yeah, I mean, this is a really tired meme. I mean, Israel and America have been saying that, Iran is the greatest funder of terrorism around the world. And it's like, where? Like, I mean, Hezbollah isn't Hezbollah is a militia. I mean, they're not. They were the main factor why Lebanon didn't fall to the Israelis. It's like,
yeah, they're a militant movement. Like, yeah, they could be considered a terrorist organization under some circumstances. But you think terrorism, you think Al Qaeda, you think 9/11, you think the Boston bombing. Exactly. You don't think of a group engaged on a battlefield with Israel.
Yeah. None of it happened. So again, another instance of incompetency, of basically fear mongering.
Yeah, and then of course that all culminated at the end of July with Trump's all caps tweet, which honestly it was hilarious, and that also spurred on another Tucker Carlson rant about why war with Iran would be bad. So it worked out in the end.
There has to be a direct line between Trump and Tucker.
I mean, he was the first person he talked to after the Russia summit.
Yeah, I'm absolutely positive.
But in July was also a great month with Trump getting tough with NATO, criticizing member states for not paying enough, and he pretty much called it an obsolete body. Now, he criticized NATO countries for trading with Russia, saying, if Russia's supposedly this great threat, then why do you have so many trade ties with them? And doesn't that kind of defeat your argument on why the U.S. has to pay for your defense?
Yeah, another very salient point, and it was also another very heretical move by Trump, questioning NATO. Why is NATO even like? I mean, if we cataloged how many things he has said that are directly contrary to the West and to its order and to its positions. I think we're probably going to have 30 major points in just the last 2 years.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would go more, but another thing that really was thrown in the neoliberals is the U.S. intelligence agencies, not even anyone affiliated with Trump, admitted that China was the primary threat to the U.S. and Russia was, and I quote, an afterthought.
Yeah.
And
I mean, obviously, a lot of Europeans would like better relations with Russia, um, because a lot of Europeans are afraid in the coming years of if Russia, I mean, sorry, if China continues rising. I mean, this will take decades. Let's be honest. But people would rather not live in a world where the world order tends to favor China.
yeah, I mean, what do you think is going to happen to Russian-Chinese relations when China starts all these infrastructure projects in, for example, Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan or countries right on Russia's border? Do you think it's going to be as good as it is now? I'm telling you, it's not going to be. Considering the fact Russia and China, the only reason why this axis exists between them is because the neoconservatives are still in power in the U.S. And if they weren't, if the foreign policy of the U.S. was the Trump foreign policy 100% of the time, Russia and China would not be as friendly as they are. They'd probably be actually adversarial towards each other.
Right, which kind of harkens back to some of the points Trump was making very early on in his presidency. And that was, I mean, there were people in the dissident right that have been talking about this for years, and that is that, as you point out, this alliance between China and Russia, um, is just a convenient one. Obviously, I mean that's understood. However, without that alliance, both these countries wouldn't fare very well.
Yeah, given the opportunity tomorrow, uh, Russia would completely dump China for India because you see, this year I actually left this off the notes, but yeah, Russia and India they've been improving relations with weapons deals, other trade deals. But yeah, given the opportunity, I think Putin would drop Xi for Modi in a heartbeat. But speaking of Putin, this is when Trump and Putin met in Helsinki. This was the same month. And
Yeah,
this soothed a lot of tensions that were building at the beginning of the year that probably culminated with the serious strikes on both sides. And Trump was actually the first U.S. president to admit the U.S. shoulders quite a bit of the blame for the current state of U.S.-Russian relations.
that was incredible. That was really monumental. I think a lot of people had all kinds of, especially the Dems. Were holding their breath as to what was going to be said. And I think Trump basically confirmed their worst fears.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Which was good.
The U.S. is in the wrong. We're in the wrong. Russia isn't the great Satan.
Yeah, exactly. It confirmed that Russia was the great Satan.
Yeah.
And of course the puppet memes came out. So it's confirmed Putin really does control Trump. I mean, he's all along he has been about improving ties, as if there isn't any support for that in America and Europe. As if that doesn't exist, as if that's not a sentiment, as if his base who elected him didn't want that.
Yeah, a lot of people who elected Trump, the people who got him the nomination. Now, of course, most just people who identify as Republicans and would vote for anyone with an R after their name. They may not support it, but they'll support it if a Republican does it. I mean, you'll always have that support, but yeah, a lot of his core base that actually got him the nomination, that put him where he was, were in favor. They're like, stop the neoconservatism, stop playing nuclear chicken with Russia. It's not going to end well. But one last thing out of July. This is actually towards the end of July. This is when Orban gave his Christian illiberal democracy speech, which pretty much solidified the populist bloc as a cultural and geopolitical force, and probably, as I said during the time, was the speech of the decade.
Yeah, it was the first time a speech like that was given in the EU, and it was a speech that I think people would have mistaken Putin would have said.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, 2018 was, for us anyways, was a very good year when it's all tallied up.
Yeah, I mean, we took a lot of hits, but, as a net total, I say we came out pretty good. barring a few losses. Now, of course, the INF stuff, I'm not too happy about. I don't think it's going to be too significant, but again, we'll get into that later. We'll get into that. But I'm not the most satisfied about it. Now, August was a very slow month. Now, despite a couple stories. Now, the first one was Dianne Feinstein's personal driver got outed as a Chinese spy. This guy's been working for her for 20 years. Not only her driver, but her advisor. I think he was actually a congressional staffer as well. And for the past 20 years, this man has been a Chinese spy.
Yeah. And no one said a thing. No one said a thing. It's almost like this whole thing is connected, with Amazon, and it's almost
boy.
like the corporations are so invested in China that stuff like this completely slips. Can you imagine if? We could all imagine what would happen if there would be an investigation. Trump would be impeached if it was. Yeah.
Well, if Rand Paul had a Ukrainian driver, they would find a way to spin that towards Russia.
Yeah.
But the other big pivotal story that came out of August was Turkey began to actually make its pivot towards Russia. Granted, it's been happening since about 2015, 2016, but it really kicked off when Trump came out about the pastor, I believe his name was Andrew Brunson, who Turkey was holding captive after the coup. And pretty much Trump decided, I'm going to put sanctions, I'm going to put tariffs, specifically on the steel industry, to put economic pressure on Turkey. It really shuttered the lira, which of course is the Turkish currency, and saw Erdogan, even more so than he had been in the past few years, reach out to Putin, reach out to Russia, and pretty much drift towards that sphere. Now, granted, he does the back and forth all the time. This is just the direction he's leaning towards now. But that was probably the biggest story to come of August, at least geopolitically.
Yeah, I think Erdogan has also paid attention to the shift that's taking place in Europe, just as Netanyahu has. And they know it's moving towards a populism. They know they're getting tired of the liberal order, and that doesn't bode well for acceptance into the EU for Turkey.
He's pretty much given up on that. And, Turkey is this country, just because of its geographical position, that it's been courted by the United States, by the European Union, by the Russians, and even more so in the recent years by the Chinese.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just thought that was probably one of the most interesting stories out of August, because you saw it. What?
Yeah, because I think before the Russian jet was down by the Turks, things were already moving in that direction, and it was sort of touch and go what would happen between Russia and Turkey. But
ironically enough, that was probably the best thing to happen for the relations between the two countries.
Yeah.
Because Putin didn't react. He didn't do what pretty much any other leader in the world. He said, we'll take this as it is. It's one jet. We're not happy about it, but it's not worth starting a war over.
Yeah, again, it was Putin. I think if you want to know Russia, I think you have to pay attention to Putin. He is he's most aware, I think, of what Russia's strengths and weaknesses are.
Oh, absolutely. And just to move on with Turkey, I want to get into September. Now, September, I would say, was marked by the, as I have deemed it, the Idlib standoff. Now, it was assumed by pretty much everyone that Assad would begin an offensive in Idlib, considering the fact he delayed it in July upon the request of Putin. Now, the U.S. made veiled threats against Syria in the form of Assad better not use chemical weapons again, but we all knew that meant Assad better not go into Idlib. Anyone who actually pays attention, that is. Now, growing Turkish-Russian ties resulted in a very rickety patchwork ceasefire in Idlib, with Putin once again having Assad halt his offensive. Many feared a third false flag and another serious strike. It was also announced at that time the U.S. would be staying in Syria indefinitely. Now, again, we'll get into that later, but that was pretty much a standoff because a lot of people thought there was going to be a third Syria strike. I don't want to brag. I don't want to sound too cocky, but I kind of saw through that. I didn't think Assad was dumb enough to go into Idlib because the only thing that would prevent another false flag is if he stays out of Idlib and lets the West and their puppets have that buffer zone. If he's willing to take that little loss and if he's willing to listen to Putin, it'll benefit him in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I see Turkey becoming even more interwoven with Russia and the Eurasian project going on.
Yeah, and I'll get into this as we get towards like the December news, but I think a lot of the U.S. withdrawal, of course, if you listen to Bolton, is predicated on what Turkey says. And I think Turkey is also wise enough. Erdogan, as much as I criticized him, he's not a dumb man. I think he's also wise enough to play in the U.S. demands enough because Erdogan doesn't want U.S. troops there as much as pretty much Assad or Russia does.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's going to be interesting to see, what happens next.
Yeah, like I said, I'll get in that because I saw some things that point both in a positive and negative direction. But September was also when Israeli strikes on Syria continued, and as a result, they used the Russian spy plane for cover, and that was downed by Syrian air defenses. And tensions skyrocketed, but were quickly diffused. Again, that's one of those things where Putin isn't too quick to react and start a war over a small incident. This did, however, result in Russia giving Syria the S-300.
Yeah, which hasn't exactly stopped Israel, but Israel is now forced to be more careful.
Yeah, I mean, it slowed it down. It hasn't stopped it by any means.
Yeah. And I'm sure now Russia is more aware of what Israel is, attempting to do in order to gain cover. The F-35s aren't doing very well. They haven't proven to be the aircraft that Israel had hoped it to be. But again, I think Israel is. I think a lot of these attacks by Israel are kind of a desperation, either to show a sign of strength or to convince America has to stay there, and it's not convincing.
Yeah, and in terms of the the Israeli strikes in Syria, Russia, of course, doesn't like it, but again, it's one of those things that they tolerate because at the end of the day, so long as they stay away from Tartus and the airbase they have there, I believe it's Latakia, Russia will pretty much tolerate because they know Israel won't go for a full-scale war because they don't have the drive or the wherewithal to do that. So I think, like, if, for example, maybe if this were 10 years ago and the Israelis had more manpower, more morale, the Russians might be more concerned. Granted, if this were 10 years ago, the Russians would also be in a much weaker position, but that's aside the point. But just in more September news, you'll recall this is also when there was the assassination attempt on Bolsonaro with the near fatal stabbing, and I argue this is what won him the election.
Yeah.
Because before that, he was doing well. He was like second in the polls. He was definitely going to go into the second round of the elections, but I thought he was going to lose by that razor-thin margin. But I think the minute he got assassinated, I think that probably convinced a lot of people who were either apolitical or undecided that if that's what the opposition has to offer, I think I'm going to go with Bolsonaro, even though I don't necessarily like him. I think it was almost like a Trump effect on steroids.
I know. I mean, I'm not happy with Bolsonaro, but everything about him. However, in the big scheme of things, I still think he's preferable.
Yeah, he's definitely.
And it was really a shock to the system for like a lot of lefties in North America. I think they were quite shocked that he won. I didn't expect him to win. I too thought in the latter rounds that he wouldn't be elected. But he has, and he's turning out to be truly terrifying.
Yeah, and in terms of like more of the Zionistic things that he's done, or some of the stuff he's done towards the environment, I'm not the happiest with, but it's not a deal breaker for me. I think ultimately he's probably the best option they had. But also in September news, they closed out the month with every world leader making a fool of themselves, almost every world leader making a fool of themselves at the UN General Assembly. Now, Trump's speech straddled that line between nationalism and globalism, which showed the internal struggle, the tug of war within his administration. Because he talked about how sovereignty was important, how we have to think of nations as nations, not all part of like this one world, and globalism is pretty much crap. But then he also spent time warmongering against Syria and Iran, saying the Syrians better not use chemical weapons, which of course translates to the Syrians better not go into Idlib. Yeah, he also said, "Oh, yeah, look at how great Israel is." So he really straddled that line, but it was definitely better than the 2017 speech.
Yeah, I mean, and we've discussed this before, that fundamentally, because it's a struggle, fundamentally the policies don't make sense in terms of, if you want nationalism, you can't have the kind of foreign policy that you're projecting. However, as the months went by, Trump is acting still trying to act far more like a nationalist than, an international empire.
Yeah, and then you'll recall, I just have to take these blows at Macron whenever I can. Macron comes out as UN speech, pretty much is the vanguard of the liberal world order and liberal internationalism. Call it what you will; it's pretty much all the same thing. And then of course he has to take his jabs at Trump, and he jabs at Trump specifically on that one over the Israeli-Palestinian issue, saying you can't you can't pretend to be a neutral arbiter when you're siding with Israel on every issue. Now, keep in mind, this is the same guy who just a week before, you got to remember, France was part of that strike when the Russian jet got down. France has bombed Syria more than the U.S. has. So he has lectured Trump about why he can't take Israel's side too much, while pretty much taking Israel's side on almost every foreign policy issue, minus the Iran deal.
Yeah, I mean, Macron's a joke, as we already know. But Europe is in this funny position where it in many ways is part of the global order that America is part of, and in other ways, the issue with Israel and Palestine, they're at odds with where America stands. And I would say the reason for it is because in Europe, there isn't any support for Israel the way that it exists here. I mean, in America, there's literally like evangelical grassroots movements that, like, if you denounce Israel, you might be asked to leave the church.
Yeah,
that just doesn't exist in Europe.
Yeah, and it's funny because 10, 20 years ago, when Israel could be considered something of a liberal democracy, they recently passed the nation-state law last year. Yeah, the liberal world order could accept them because, oh, look, they're the one shining beacon, the only democracy in the Middle East, blah, 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 blah. But now that they're moving in towards the more nationalistic direction, which, I can't necessarily fault them for, with the nation-state law saying we are definitively a Jewish state, a lot of the internationalists in the European Union and a lot of people in the liberal world order is like, Israel isn't too liberal anymore, and they may, challenge our interests.
Yeah. But on the other hand, still expect us to be their ally.
Oh, yeah. It's like, oh, yeah, we're going to denounce you. We're going to denounce your nationalism, but have some billions of dollars. Have our used weapons.
Yeah, and it's a proposition that's going to have diminishing returns for Israel, because it doesn't matter how long the EU stays together, and it won't matter if the EU, for instance, is or Europe in general goes into a more nationalist mode in the next 10, 20 years. The truth is that in either direction, Israel's going to have less support.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And now we can finally move into October, the month defined by one man named Jamal Khashoggi, the quite literally liquidated CIA asset who turned the entire establishment against Saudi Arabia, and that we talked about just completely at length on the show. Spent 5 weeks, even after I took that 3-week break in November. We come back, it's still Khashoggi.
Yeah. Which is kind of amazing because he's literally somebody that nobody except the liberal order cared about. Trump didn't seem really genuinely concerned about it. And the reaction that it got put Saudi Arabia in a bad spot, which is actually good considering the war that they've been involved in Yemen for so long. So, you know, I don't know who killed him, but thanks.
Yeah. And you know that's one event where you have Rand Paul, Marco Rubio, and Lindsey Graham all putting out a joint statement.
Yeah.
That's how twisted this situation was. And again, I would talk about this more at length, but if you want to hear that, just go back to any of our episodes in October.
Yeah.
And you know I expect that to last a week or two. We're talking about this for an episode 2, maybe 3, if it really pulls on. But no, we talked about it. You know, again for almost 2 months. Again, I come back in late November, early December. All of a sudden, we're still talking about this. You know, CIA asset that got liquidated by the Saudi government. Now, October was this probably my biggest complaint about Trump. One of my biggest complaints about Trump this year, outside of the immigration issue, is the U.S. threatened to leave the INF over Russian violations. Now, I will say this. They were saying, oh, Russian medium-range missiles. Of course, we all know why the Russians were developing medium-range missiles. Probably because the U.S. has had them in Romania since 2008. You know, I bet it's nothing to do with that. That's just a coincidence that the Russians are violating the treaty. But pretty much the treaty hasn't meant anything since it was signed. It honestly, when it was signed, it hardly meant anything at all. Now, just for the formality reasons, just for the symbolic reasons, I opposed pulling out of it. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's too big of a deal.
Yeah, I don't think neither country is wedded to it. Russia certainly can't afford to be wedded to it, and it can't press America to stay to it either. Considering America doesn't have to worry about nuclear missiles just a few hundred miles from its border, whereas Russia does.
Russia put a plane it had in the 1960s in Venezuela. It's a second Cuban Missile Crisis, didn't you know?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was truly terrifying.
Yeah. A lot of people are trying to say, like, Russia's putting, like, it's honestly, I would call them shell planes because I bet what they're putting there is probably not their the best of the best. But yeah, they're putting like small amounts of assets in Venezuela, probably because of this. You know, granted, I'm not too concerned. I'm not the happiest with it, but I don't think it's World War III.
I think it's just a reactionary move.
Like
I put very little stock in it.
Yeah, if we pulled our missiles out of, I don't know, say Poland, they would probably pull them out of Venezuela. It's probably something as simple as that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, pretty much. There is some more optimistic moves on that. Trump said he'd be willing to renegotiate. Putin said, "Oh yeah, maybe it's time we readdress this." And even in their New Year's call, I think it was either a phone call or a letter to each other. Putin said, "I'm more than happy to work with the U.S. on future arms control and discussing the issues that face our country." And Trump pretty much reciprocated everything Putin said. But one of the big things that this show predicted in the month of October, we didn't predict it in the month of October. We predicted it over the summer. But one of our predictions that came to pass was that public support for the war in Yemen plummeted.
Yeah.
And that was thanks to Khashoggi yet again. Again, for a guy I couldn't care less about, who was probably, and not probably, who was definitely a terrible person. He was up there with the likes of Osama bin Laden, shilling for the Saudi regime until Mohammed bin Salman came in power. By all metrics, an awful person with awful beliefs. In his death, he gives us a plummeted public support for the war in Yemen.
Right, and plummeted support for Saudi Arabia in general. Hot take. Maybe the guy who killed them wanted the war in Yemen to end.
Maybe that rogue agent had an agenda of his own. Maybe he's the real hero in all of this. But honestly, the entire Khashoggi story, that's pretty much all I have to say about October because that's all we talked about for October. But let's get into November, the month I unfortunately had to take a hiatus because I was busy with my life. I apologize for that. Hopefully that won't happen again. But this is when sanctions in Iran came into effect, with very little happening. I doubt they're even being followed by most countries, pretty much outside the U.S. and maybe, I don't know, a couple European countries. But I will say that I think the sanctions in Iran would have been much worse, if not a month before there wasn't a giant mishap with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, that's also very convenient time, considering the fact we're going to put the most tough sanctions we ever had on the Iranians, and it's going to be awful. It's going to cripple them. Then all of a sudden, Saudi Arabia, which would be a key partner if you want to ice out the Iranians, all of a sudden they have this mishap to the point Congress loses support for them. Trump doesn't necessarily lose support for them, but he is like, yeah, I really don't care. I'm not going to support for Saudi Arabia. It makes me wonder, maybe that guy had a clue what was going on and thought, if I do this, maybe I can save the world.
Yeah, I'll admit it. I was quite worried in the summer about how the sanctions on Iran would impact Iran. I mean, honestly, that's a long-term standing goal for America is to weaken Iran. I know Israel plays a huge factor in it, but I think so does Saudi Arabia. It's the third largest oil producer, and its production is constrained. Anyhow, I don't know if any administration is going to change its tune.
Well, I think pretty much the U.S. will keep up pressure on Iran into their own quote-unquote yellow. They'll just finally have enough and tear down the establishment. But we'll get into the yellow stuff later. But discuss a couple more in November. What was the nationalism versus globalism spat Macron and Trump had on Armistice Day? You got to recall that's the one where Trump and Putin smile with each other and like the very friendly interactions, and about how we can't fall for nationalism because it's bad, but then all of a sudden his own country decides to basically burn itself down because of him.
Yeah, it's amazing how that's happened. And he was really trying to parse out his words, trying to create these distinctions between nationalism and patriotism, when they're all etymologically natalist in nature anyways. Of course, there were libs that were desperate to hear it, and they couldn't agree more. But yeah, that definitely backfired on Macron. I look at it as a kind of a last-ditch effort. This kind of laser distinction between patriotism and nationalism, which still in the end did not make sense.
But just speaking of Europe, and November was also the month where pretty much everyone accepted that to be terrible. How many people in May's cabinet resigned in November? Wasn't some about 6-7 people?
Yeah, I forget the exact number myself, but
there was that 1 week where a person would resign every day. But yeah, Brexit has pretty much been botched, and they've pretty much thrown themselves into the limbo of perpetual negotiations to the point where the European Union is probably not going to exist by the time they reach a solid deal.
Yeah, Brexit is an example of an elite class fundamentally at disagreement with a working class, and I blame this elite class for not being able to come to come through with a proper deal, because it was never in the best interest to do so.
Oh, absolutely not. What they do with Brexit is what they want to try to do here, that for some reason with Trump consistently fails over and over again. I mean, I'm not complaining, but Trump just seems to have this aura around him that protects him from these sort of things.
Yeah, I don't know quite what it is. He does have a very strong base of support, and unlike Macron or May, they don't really have a strong popular support. Like they don't have any kind of base anyone can remotely speak of. They have people who choose them for the lesser of two evils.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
right, and I think that has helped Trump. It's kept him alive, really.
Yeah. All I can say about Brexit, I think they're best off going with Nosval Corbyn, and I think he will lead them out of the European Union.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, look, 2019 is going to be the year where Corbyn comes out full Nosval. I'm calling it right now.
Him and Tucker going full Nasbo.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It cannot be stopped. But another thing that happened in November were the just absolute antics at the G20. Macron getting abandoned at the airport, getting into a married couple fight with Mohammed bin Salman, and pretty much beyond that, nothing really happened at the G20.
Yeah, pretty much. And for me, I look at Tucker and I look at what he's doing and what is happening in France as the two biggest stories for me, anyways, of 2018. Now, I mean, the Yellow Vests don't have a working ideology as to they have demands, but they don't have an ideology.
Well, they're a coalition of basically everyone who hates Macron, which is everyone who's not a neoliberal.
Right. However, Macron isn't facing any kind of challenge in his elite class, and it's certainly not from even opposing parties in government. So it's going to be interesting to see how far this is going to go. And maybe, right now there isn't going to be a kind of ideology that can keep them together. However, the only thing I worry about is possibly not necessarily, well, yeah, somebody hijacking it and not having a working philosophy as to what they expect and what kind of vision they have for the future. But I don't think the yellow vests are going to go away all that soon.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And honestly, I think the decentralization helps because if you have a structured movement, it's easier to hijack. Case in point, the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street, both those movements were hijacked by their respective establishments, whether that be left wing or right wing. Whereas the Yellow Vests is pretty much everyone who hates the establishment, but there's no centralized leadership to really hijack it from.
Yeah.
And just to finish off the November stories, we're getting close to the end, I promise, is the manufactured Kerch crisis, I like to call it, when they really tried to drum up tensions between Russia and Ukraine that pretty much nobody is talking about at this point. That's how quickly it died off.
Literally nobody cares about Ukraine.
Oh no! And their election's coming up in just it's about 6 weeks. It's March 31st, and even if it's just another establishment stooge, even if it is another EU CIA puppet, I don't think it's going to be Poroshenko.
Right, and actually, I have a Ukrainian friend who he was in Ukraine in October. He was there for about a month. He went back to visit relatives, and what he's telling me, in fact, he just told me last week, is people on social media are already discussing ideas like, I bet that Poroshenko had those snipers shoot people at Maidan just to start this whole thing off. Think about that. That's huge.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was seeing this kind of stuff on their social media. And he's not from East Ukraine, by the way. He comes from a central area. So,
like he's an actual Ukrainian, not just a Russian from Ukraine.
Exactly.
Wow. Like I said, you saw those opinion pollings towards the beginning of the year. Only 32%. Wait, no, it was 62% of Ukrainians don't see Russia as a primary threat. And then they really tried to drum this up, probably to change those numbers, probably a pre-election move for Poroshenko, and it fell flat for him, and it's probably going to be his undoing. Like I said, if it's not somebody who completely wants to reconcile relations with Russia and take Ukraine to where it was, even if it's another puppet, it's not going to be Poroshenko.
Yeah, it's not going to be him. And the Kerch fiasco was really a way after the Skripal. It was really a way to introduce new sanctions against Russia. I mean, they're literally going to have to keep manufacturing these every 6 months to introduce reasons for new sanctions against Russia. Like that's what they're left with.
And it's going to become more and more contrived, and less people are going to care. And ultimately, it's a self-destroying system.
Yeah.
Now, let's get in December. We're finally at the end of the show. We went into a little bit in the yellow vest, but yes, Macron has tanked all of his support, and France is burning to the ground. I think this upcoming Saturday will be the 9th week, if not 10th week in a row, of protests against Macron. Now, they calmed down during Christmas and New Year's for obvious reasons. People were too concerned with, all the holiday festivities. But, the minute that was over, they were out on the streets protesting Macron. Macron actually went into hiding for a couple weeks, and if I'm not mistaken, he is still in hiding. I know for a while there they had it to the point where he couldn't even step outside of his residence because they had it blocked off.
Yeah, I mean, I think Putin should troll him. I think he should offer him asylum.
I offer him a room with Yanukovych.
The irony would be so delicious, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And they're already trying to spin this one as Russian-backed movement. Now, of course, I'm not even going to go to the effort to prove why that's wrong, because it should be. I mean, anything that doesn't favor the liberal world order it's Russia's fault. No other way. Nobody opposes liberalism except the Russians. That's the way it is.
Yeah, everything was going great till this guy Putin showed up.
Oh, absolutely!
It's so ridiculous that they would even stoop to that. I mean, we all know that it's lack of coverage. I mean, it does get covered. I know a lot of people say it's not being covered in France. It is, but it's not to the degree that we think it was. We all know that if something like this was happening in Russia, literally every single prostitute would be flown there, and it would be 24/7 coverage.
Yeah, like I said, if this, I said this, back in December. If this were happening in Hungary, you would have France setting up a no-fly zone.
Yeah.
But we've discussed the yellow vests at length now. So let's just recap some of the other December stories before we leave you off here. Now, of course, Qatar actually, as of 10 days ago, has officially left OPEC, and again, that's more of a symbolic thing, and them being out, again, they weren't that big of an oil producer in the first place, but it just shows how the vestiges of the old world order, the liberal world order, are just absolutely crumbling. Because this was formed in the 1960s, it was formed, you could argue, the height of American power, or at least building up to that, and then one of the founding members is gone.
Yeah, that was pretty major news for that part of the world, because we know what kind of a role that Qatar played in negotiations, and we also suspected that this was probably directly linked to the way things were going in Syria, that it probably involves the pipeline deal that the vast majority of this war is about, is a pipeline that Assad said no to. And I mean, that's my take on it. Also, Qatar, of course, got very rich from gas. I think it's the largest or second largest producer of natural gas.
Yes. But beyond that, the Senate voted in mostly a toothless motion to end the war in Yemen. Now, of course, at the end of 2018, that was not brought to the House floor, so it wasn't official. But I see with this new Congress, say what you will about the Democrats, but one good thing we might get out of it is we might get a resolution barring U.S. support for the war in Yemen. Now, we already stopped fueling Saudi planes. We already cut some aid to them. Granted, it's not like we cut off complete support, but we've been rolling it back gradually. So, as we said, Yemen pretty much has lost popular support, and I want to finish off because there's been a lot of news about this. The Syria withdrawal, which is the last episode of the year we did last year. Now, it looked very optimistic at first, to the point where you actually have Mattis signing the paperwork for it to be official. Of course, you have all that. The timetable isn't hammered out. You see Bolton saying things, you see Trump saying things, but granted, you also have Trump giving the "we won" speech and we're getting out Syria. And then Bolton goes to Israel over the weekend and says, "Oh, our withdrawal from Syria will be conditional." Now, I wasn't too happy with this. I absolutely hate John Bolton, for those of you who don't know. But I also said there is some points of optimism here because the order has already been signed to the point where we're getting out of Syria. And again, there's a lot of bureaucratic hoops you got to jump through if you want to officially undo an order like that. But the other thing is, that's John Bolton speaking and not Trump. And I also saw headlines state that the process was starting and you're actually having U.S. troops leaving Syria now. I can share the tweet afterwards for those of you who want it if you're interested, since I can't remember who exactly, but I know it wasn't like one of these like fringe websites like you know what I'm talking about. But point being is, those are John Bolton's words, not Trump's words. And if you believe what comes out of the White House, Trump and the Walrus warlord get into fights a lot, in which it could be Bolton just said this to spite Trump, or Trump may be going against Bolton's advice just to spite him. And like I said, I've been saying this for the past couple months, mainly from an optimistic point of view, but not blind optimism. I think Bolton will be out of job soon.
I sincerely hope you're right. You know, when Trump announced it, I was semi-skeptical. I'll believe it when I see it, but I'm glad he said it. Because again, you know, I think when we're talking about Trump's presidency and we're looking at the bigger picture, it's that he says the unsayable that counts. That's going to resonate, no matter how much the media is going to try to ignore that he was ever president when his time in the office is finished. However, you know, I was also when I heard him say that, Israel's going to be fine. It doesn't matter if Iran can stay in Syria if they want. We give Israel a lot of money. I mean, that was incredible. Then I was kind of sure that this deal is going through, and I thought, like, can it be this easy? Like, what does Netanyahu think? And of course, Bolton flies out. I'm with you. You're seeing some of the first signs that they are going to move out, but I'm not yet convinced, because these things can change, and they can reduce it down to 2,000, and in a year or two, it can go back up to 8,000. The question is, like, anyhow.
I will say this, just as my final thought. I think it'll be an Iraq-style withdrawal where we get out of there officially, but our country's still crawling with mercenaries, and we still have thousands of contractors there. So all of our official presence out, but of course we're not leaving the country. And again, I won't be too satisfied with that, but that is a, I would say, significant improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you this. If they get out of eastern Syria, that little zone that they control where ISIS can go, and the Syrians who pursued ISIS there get blown away. If America leaves that, then I'll say America has officially left, even though they won't. But if that happens, then I'll be happy about it.
Yeah, if they leave Kurdish-controlled Syria, I agree with you. I'll be happy about it. Like I said, I don't. Of course, the initial optimism was very high. I don't see like a full withdrawal. I mean, we may get out of there officially, but we'll do what we did in Iraq and still have thousands of contractors in the country, which again, they're still American citizens fighting a pointless war. Mm-hmm. But I think just in terms of for America's interests and the interests of the world, I think it'll be a major improvement, although not ideal.
Yeah.
Oh, but we did it. We reviewed the entire year 2018. It only took us an hour and 53 minutes. That is a War Report record. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been the War Report. You can find us on Twitter. I have all that crap linked below if you want to find me on other platforms. I'll try to have a video out tomorrow giving a very late reaction to Trump's immigration address. But until then, I will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.